With your permission, just a couple of reflections on yesterday, because I had quite a number of people here who weren't here yesterday. We had a significant number of different uses of the word secular, which made some of the conversations sometimes at cross purposes and a little complicated. And this is not just a matter for this conference. I think it's a general matter that the word secular is rarely defined before it's used in a wide variety of ways. I mean, my own one I like very much was I got in Boston, Massachusetts, and it's "There is no God, and his mother is Mary, immaculately conceived." This seems to me to be a totally desirable account of secularity. But Rowan Williams's division of secularism into what he calls procedural and programmatic secularism was, I think, a very, very clear way of defining two of the currents that ran through the debate, with the idea of procedural secularism being what was usually called something like equidistance of the state from different faith communities, religions, and neutrality to some degree, or some degree of equal involvement in support of their institutions. And procedural secularism, I think, is something that there was something like a consensus growing in discussion as being a good thing, with even Peter Tatchell sort of touching on that as a possibility, but of more of that anon. Programmatic secularism was, I suppose you could loosely describe as a much more of the idea of the marginalization of religion, which came up, and the desire to make religion a private matter and clear religion from the public square. If you think of a sort of metaphor, we use the public square. I sort of prefer the football pitch as a way of thinking about different aspects of secularism, which I think are quite important as a background to thinking about foreign policy. If you think of Old Trafford as being, it just is, the home ground of Manchester United, in the same way there's a brand of secular thinkers who think of public space as just is secular. And in that sense, if religions, faith community leaders are going to be on it, it's rather like an old lag being let out on parole. You know, keep a close eye on them, divisive, need watching carefully. There's a sort of flavor of that in quite a lot of the debate. But if you think that in 88% of the world, the players will be playing away, if just to extend the metaphor, in the sense that when they're playing away, there will be another context completely in which secularity is just one of several world views playing on the pitch. You have another picture. And you have another element which I think we miss very often, and I heard it on a number of occasions implicitly in the discussion. And that is that when we're playing at home, as it were, on our own secular terrain where we live in secular societies, there is a strange way in which the secular worldview players are both players and then suddenly turn into the referee and the linesman. And this is quite a complex process that goes on, but I think we need to watch out for that very interesting mutation, because it takes away concepts of neutrality, and of course is characteristic of a much more programmatic approach to secularism in societies. The second thing I did notice, and that was that we moved in sort of the mode of discourse between diatribe, debate, and dialogue. And since dialogue is one of the major programs that we have for secondary school children in 17 different countries around the world in the foundation, I was kind of quite alert to the difference between the two. In debate, clearly you want to win the argument, you want to defeat the opponent and their views. In dialogue, you listen. You try to deepen your understanding. You try to increase your understanding of the other and of your own point of view, your own religion. And you hope that in this process you will be given new insights. You hope that this becomes a mutual quest for something called the truth. And I think the balance very often that we have in societies, particularly in societies where the middle is eroding, as for example in the United States, is very important to preserve so that we don't endlessly debate or indeed engage in diatribes, but that dialogue becomes the mode, the Habermas conversation becomes the mode, and clearly has to be the mode in somewhere like a world university where we are today. I'd like to go on to look at what happens in the two contexts, the domestic and the international, because in the international, as we've seen in Egypt, the referee and the linesman can easily become the army, and the consequences of that in terms of a democratic project are deeply disturbing. And I suppose this is one of the things that in our international relations we're going to have to really sort out. What do we mean by democracy? How much do we care about democracy? Can we have another Algeria, another Egypt, on the basis of the fact that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with the type and tone and authoritarianism of the elected government that is put in power? I think this is really quite an important question for the future. Finally, by way of reflections, I had a very interesting conversation with Peter Berger, fun enough, in Boston. And it's very clear that he has, very clear in the sense that he's made a second publication some time ago where he repudiates the sort of secularism thesis that we will ineluctably move towards what, for a better word is called, secular society. Religion will be marginalized, will disappear, wither away on the vine. He's clearly repudiated that. But he's held on, and I think quite rightly, to the position that because we have clearly secular institutions in our society and we have clearly religious institutions in our society, that we model this in our brains. So there's no such thing as being secular. There's no such thing as being religion, as it were. We have the capacity to think religiously, and we have the capacity to think in a secular sort of the way. Now, clearly, various people differ in that regard. The Dalai Lama can doubtless be very good at IT, and a Wall Street banker can doubtless be a very sort of pious follower of evangelical Christianity. So we don't want to sort of make too much of that division either. On to the topic, NGOs. Funny word, really, non-governmental. It's a bit like non-white or non-Catholic. And in a way, I suppose civil society is the kind of nice, cuddly word that avoids the negativity. The exponential growth of international NGOs in the second half of the 20th century clearly has transformed the nature and significance of cross-border interventions. We think very often of interventions as boots on the ground, whether they're the boots of Oxfam workers or whether they're the boots of military. But in fact, we do need to think, I think, in a much wider way that because so much of international relations now are mediated via international NGOs, and therefore we need to think of the significance of these international NGOs in their relationship to the more formal diplomatic relationships that take place. Civil society leapt up the agenda at the fall of the Soviet Union as that which the Soviet Union did not have and that which you needed to have if you were going to run capitalism effectively and not have a bunch of KBG crooks taking over in a predatory kind of a way. You needed the institutions of civil society. I mean, when I when I started in development work, civil society was what you did in Latin America to try and combat the power of the military oligarchies and the dictatorships. It was the voice of advocacy. And I suppose the two characteristics of the NGOs are, of course, their capacity for advocacy towards government and towards international institutions, whether it's on human rights, on climate change, or on developmental issues, and at the same time their quite extraordinary ability to act as networks for information flows, and on top of that, in the realm of health and education, obviously, their role as service providers of great significance in Africa and considerable significance in other parts of the world, Asia and Africa. By the end of the 1990s, we got this separate category, which most academics detest as being far too broad, but it's very difficult to think of any other word. That is the FBOs or the FIOs, the faith-based organizations, and the faith-inspired organizations, which can equally be domestic and international. And here again, it was mainly, I think, in the developmental sphere that these organizations began to become part of the considerations of the major international governmental organizations. It was Wolfenson in the World Bank in 1999, developed the World Faith Development Dialogue, and so on and so on. Obviously, things like Amnesty International and the human rights organizations were already sort of coming out very often of some sort of religious beginnings. They're not necessarily ending up as Oxfam, of course, was Quaker in its origins, although now it would fall into the bag of secular development agencies and so on. But if we really think about FBOs and NGOs, you do have to get away from, I hate the word iconic, but let's use it, the iconic ones like Amnesty, like Oxfam, like World Vision, and so on. And remember that Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Pentecostal churches as such, which were this huge major wave of Christian mission expansion from the 1960s onwards with considerable impact. You really need to know as much about Pentecostals as you do about Islam, I think, in the 21st century. This vast sort of movement outwards also sort of comes under the heading of FBOs. The World Council of Churches is, if you like, but it's very different. And you can see why academics are not going to like this concept, because it's covering pears, peaches, and apples. It's not covering anything that is very coherent as a category. Religious leaders are different and need to be treated differently by diplomats than faith communities, which are different sorts of things, and they're different from FBOs. What are the challenges, then, to the diplomatic world today? I've mentioned one already. The second, I think, is conceptual. It's to escape from this facile binary opposition between the secular and the religious or faith. The fact of the matter is, even in the sacred individualistic terrain of human rights discourse, if you really track it back, it's coming out of religious contexts. I was fascinated by Timothy Shah's very interesting work that he's done on Thomas Jefferson, who considered to be a sort of on the secular side of things, to put it mildly, in the United States of America. And Jefferson, in thinking about the role of religious liberty in the United States of America, read Tertullian. Now, Tertullian is theologically what might be called something of a Christian zealot. And Tertullian was writing to a number of people about the persecution of Christians and the importance of the concept of religious liberty. Actually, in Latin, uses the word religious liberty. And the interesting thing is that Timothy had pulled out the Tertullian that Jefferson had found in the Library of Congress. And guess what? Underlined were the parts on religious liberty. How much more have I got? 5 minutes? Well, that's good. I thought it was going to be much less than that.
It's a little bit less,
okay. let us get away then, as anybody involved in de-radicalization of jihadi takfiri terrorists knows, let's get away from the idea that there is a kind of division between the socioeconomic and political and the religious when it comes to motivations. You get this endless, ridiculous argument. Is it about socioeconomic political struggle, or is it caused by religion? The more interesting question is, how do socioeconomic and political struggles and conflicts get religionized, get turned so that they present like the nationalism of Northern Ireland, which we had a very interesting account of from David Trimble yesterday, from the nationalism of Northern Ireland, into something that presents as Protestants and Christians. How do the enormous poverty of northeast Nigeria turn itself into bunches of youth running around burning down churches and reprisals with Muslims being murdered? It's a very important question. So let's accept then that certainly in terms of terrorist recruitment, if you do not give youth hope and opportunity, you can do all the ideological de-radicalization you like. You can talk about, that's the wrong concept of shaheed, that's the wrong concept of jihad, that's the wrong concept of bayat, loyalty. And you can win the argument, but you're going to lose the war. Let's not use the war. We're going to lose the law enforcement struggle. Thank God we've got away from the war on terror. As Madeleine Albright said, every time the United States wages war on an ism, it tends to come unstuck. Worth remembering, I think, in embassies around the world. Last question, last point, really, I'd like to make is we've got a problem in some, I think, of our ministries in terms of discipline. We've got partnership principles from DFID in the United Kingdom, which is all about how is government going to fund religious organizations around the world. Are all the civil servants in that ministry on board with that? Are the field officers of DFID? I very much doubt it, but it's government policy. Why isn't it happening? Why is it so slow? Because people carry huge amounts of emotional baggage about religion on their back. They cannot deal with religious entities in a pragmatic kind of way, or at least they find it very, very difficult. Very last point, and apologies, Sean, if I've run just a second over. We're seeing a very, very interesting development in the growth of units on religious freedom, both in the United States and in Canada. German government have made the pursuit of religious freedom absolutely fundamental and as a sort of core mainstreaming in their diplomatic work, and so on. We have in the Foreign Office people dedicated to working in that area, though we don't actually have a comparable unit, but still within the framework of human rights. We will get, and this I think again is another challenge to diplomats, we're going to get a kickback from that. Human rights were so politicized in the Cold War that the old group, the Bandung 1955, the so-called non-aligned movement, and it's, the Brazils, the South Africas, and particularly the countries with significant Muslim populations, are going to see this as a plot, as a Muslim-bashing plot. So our conduct, it isn't. Our conduct of the prosecution, as it were, of religious freedom around the world has got to be deeply sensitive. Maybe we've got to move out of human rights discourse into discussions of human values, but whatever we do, we've got to balance that. It's got to be work on the Rohingya. At the same time, it's got to be looking at the persecution of Christians and Muslims in Gujarat, and it's rather than a kind of exercise in bashing the Muslim states, because the predictable reaction to that will be very negative. There's a lot more I'd love to say, but 15 minutes is the rule. Thank you.